Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, so last week we were talking about the masala of changing from ushri to kharaj, and then if a Muslim was to buy the land from a taghlibi, what's going to happen? Is it going to be doubled? And we mentioned the ikhtilaf between Abu Hanifa, Muhammad, and Abu Yusuf on this masala. And if you want to read more about kharaj, then the best place that I would say you can read about it is in Fatawa Tatar Khaniya. So in Fatawa Tatar Khaniya, in the end of the section of Zakat, he's got a whole section on all you need to know about kharaj. Yeah, all the different types of lands and the rulings. And I'm not going to mention them because a lot of them don't have to do with Zakat, but they're just to do with how the Muslim government deals with the kharaj issues. So today's lesson, إذا كانت لمسلم دار خطة فجعلها بستانا فعليه العشر. So إذا كانت لمسلم, when a Muslim owns a dar, which is a home, daru khitta. So daru khitta is a type of home which was basically when the Muslims conquered the land, then this land was then, let's say, divided. So this was given to, let's say, for example, a Muslim person. So a Muslim is given this land. This is known as dar khitta, meaning khatta lahul imam. Yeah, so the imam drew it out for him. So he was like one of the first residents of that land. So this property he's got, this house, the home, which is a dar khitta, فَجَعَلَهَا بُسْتَانًا. So now what he's done is that home, he's converted it into a big garden. Now he grows things on there. So does he have to give, what does he have to give on there? So فَعَلَيْهِ الْأُشْرِ. So he's expected to give ushur on there, meaning the land is not going to be considered a kharaj land. It's going to be considered to be an ushri land. معناه إذا سقاه بماء العشر. So this is when the land is irrigated with ushur water. So what does it mean by ushur water? So ushur water basically means that if the water is from a river that flows in a piece of land that falls under the ruling of ushur. So by default, all land is considered to be kharaj land. And then those lands that Muslims have owned themselves and inherited from each other, those are the ushur lands. So if the water obviously comes from the sky, then it's ushur. If it comes from a river that's in an ushur land, then it's ushur. But if it comes from a river that's in a kharaj land, then that water will be considered, or that land, the produce of that land will be considered to be kharaj. أما إذا كانت تسقى بماء الخراج. However, if that garden, the bustan, is irrigated with water that comes from kharaj land, ففيها الخراج, then there'll be the ruling of kharaj will apply to this. Yeah, and the reason is because you look at the land according to its what is known as the inzal of the land. The inzal is basically the sort of like resources of that land, the water of that land. لأن المؤونة في مثل هذا تدور مع الماء. Yeah, so the duty of the land revolves around the water. That's how it works. So whatever the land produces requires water, and then that water, if it's in a kharaj land, it's going to be considered to be kharaj, and if it's in a non-kharaj land, it's a non-kharaj. Now, if you want to read more about this, Binaya has discussed this in a bit of detail, and Binaya actually goes into and I mentioned this to you a few lessons ago, about the different types of kharaj land and ushur land. So he lists all the types of ushur land, all the types of kharaj land. You can check that. So the point is that he wants to mention is that if there is a property that has been designated or given to a Muslim when the land was conquered, then this property itself, if it was converted into a garden, then that garden would be considered to be ushur by default when it is irrigated with ushur water. So if it's irrigated with kharaj water, it's kharaj. But a land that is originally ushur land, if the land is ushur and it was not a property, it was simply just a piece of land, that will be ushur even if it's irrigated with kharaj water. Okay. وَلَيْسَ عَلَى الْمَجُوسِيِّ فِي دَارِهِ شَيْءٌ. Okay, so there is nothing upon a Majusi, there is nothing upon a Majusi in his property at all. Meaning that a fire worshipper, if a fire worshipper had a property, then he doesn't have any special tax that he has to pay on it. لأن عمر رضي الله جعل المساكن عفوا, because Umar رضي الله made property, so a property you live in, there's no special sort of like tax you have to pay on it. The only tax is the kharaj one, and that is based upon produce of land. So if you have a dar, a big massive dar, and you don't use it for growing anything, even if it has a small little like place so you can plant things and grow things, there's no specific kharaj rulings attached to it. وَإِن جَعَلَهَا بُسْتَانًا, and then what if he was to make it into a bustan? So because he's a non-Muslim, فَعَلَيْهِ الْخَرَاج. Yeah, even if وَإِن سَقَاهَا بِمَعْنَ أُشْرٍ, like I told you. Yeah, remember I told you the difference. So there's three types of this. Let's say, for example, there's three types of scenarios. If the land by default is kharaj, then that's always going to be kharaj, irrespective of the irrigation method. If the land is ushur, then it's always going to be ushur land, irrespective of the method. And if the land, however, is a property, like a building or structure, and then that's been demolished and a garden's been built there, then over there, we look at, is it owned by a Muslim? Was it owned by a Muslim? Then if it owned by a Muslim, you look at irrigation method. And if it's owned by a non-Muslim, then you consider it to be kharaj. So in saqaha bima al-ushur lita'adhuri ijab al-ushur, because you can't apply the ruling of ushur to it. So ushur can only be applied. A Muslim can give ushur and a Muslim can give kharaj. But a non-Muslim can only give kharaj. A non-Muslim cannot give ushur. إذ فيه معنى القربة, because the meaning of ushur is an ibadah, and ibadah requires a method of qurba, gaining closeness to Allah, and a non-Muslim does not have that luxury. فَتَعَيَّنَ الْخَرَاج, therefore the only other option is two options. The only other option is kharaj. وَهُوَ أُقُوبَةٌ تَلِيقُ بِحَالِهِ, and technically kharaj is considered to be a type of, you can say, penalty. This is a type of penalty which is because they are non-Muslims, and it befits the hal of the Majusi, because the Majusi is a non-Muslim. وَعَلَى قِيَاسِ قَوْلِهِمَا, and based upon the qiyas of their qawl, yeah, على قولهما meaning Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf's, يجب العشر في الماء الأشري. Yeah, so ushur would be necessary if a land has been irrigated with ma al-ushri. Yeah, so if you remember from last week, we mentioned about Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf rahimullah with regards to that particular type of land that the Taghlibi had, and he sells it to a Muslim. And then we mentioned Imam Muhammad's opinion. Imam Muhammad's opinion was that wherever the mu'una of the land was, wherever the wadhifa of the land was, so if it was a kharaj, it stays kharaj. If it's ushur, it stays ushur, irrespective of who becomes owner of it. And Imam Abu Yusuf says that the illa revolves around kufr. Yeah, so there's no kufr, then it goes back to being ushur. And in this case, because he's a kafir, then obviously it stays as it is. إِلَّا أَنَّ عِنْدَ مُحَمَّدٍ أُشْرٌ وَاحِدٌ. However, according to Imam Muhammad, he says one ushur, like we explained this last week. And in the Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, two ushurs. Yeah, so he's going to have to give double. So remember, according to Abu Yusuf, the wadhifa will not change. You will not switch from ushur to kharaj. But all we do will just double the ushur. وَقَدْ مَرَّ الْوَجْهِ فِيهِ. So he's saying the reasoning for this has already passed, right? So I'm not going to go through it, but it's basically talking about this masla over here. Yeah, so وَلَوْ كَانَتِ الْأَرْضِ مُسْلِمٍ. Yeah, and then we said عند أبي حنيفة خراج وعند أبي يوسف عليه الأشر مضاعفا doubled, and عند محمد هي أشرية على حالها. Yeah. Okay, then he says ثم الماء الأشري. Then this concept of ushri water. What is ushri water? Ushri water is ماء السماء, so rain, والآبار, so any land that's irrigated through wells, والأيون, and springs, والبحار, and rivers, التي لا تدخل تحت ولاية أحد, which do not fall under the jurisdiction of anyone. They don't fall under the authority of anyone. Yeah, these are like naturally occurring. They don't fall under, they're not tabi of land basically. لا تدخل, they do not fall under the wilaya of anyone at all. Right, so these are considered to be, like we say, exempt. والماء الخراجي, what is ماء الخراجي though? So what is kharaj water? So kharaj water is ma'ul anhar. This is specifically river water. Yeah, and the reason is because those rivers, allati, which have been dug, right? So those rivers that have been dug by the A'ajim. A'ajim meaning non-Arabs. So the non-Arabs that have dug those rivers, then it's basically in the ruling of kharaj. وَمَاءُ جَيْحُونَ. So now there's some famous rivers that he wants to discuss, like Jayhun and Sayhun. These are the two rivers when we say Ma wara al-Nahar. Yeah, the north of Afghanistan, south of Russia. Yeah, Tajikistan and these countries. So they have the Jayhun and the Sayhun. What's the ruling of these two? Yeah, so he says Jayhun and Sayhun. You can see them on the map today as well. So if you go on Google Map, you can actually find these. Dijla. Yeah, so Dijla is in Iraq. Furat is in Iraq. These are the two famous rivers, yeah, in Iraq. So he says, these are considered to be Ushri in the Muhammadin. Yeah, these are considered to be Ushri according to Imam Muhammad. All these four. لأنه لا يحميها أحد كالبحار. Because in reality, no one protects them. They're so big that they don't come under the jurisdiction of anyone as well. So he doesn't look at the digging of them. He just says they don't come under anyone's jurisdiction. They are basically have been there for ages. And they're like the seas and the oceans. Just like no one really kind of owns the ocean. وَخَرَاجِيٌّ إِنْدَ أَبِي Yusuf. And Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, he says, no, these are considered to be kharaji. لأنها يتخذ عليها القناطير من السفن. Because you can actually put on top of their qanatir min as-sufun. Like you can almost like put ships across them and almost make like a bridge over them. Yeah, so qanatir min as-sufun, you can put bridges, boats across them to cross over. وَهَذَا يَدٌ عَلَيْهِ. So like obviously in our times now, we have rivers that we can actually build massive bridges. One of the biggest bridges in the world in China is over 100 kilometers long. Yeah, over 100 kilometers. So what they were trying to identify is, what does it mean to have control over a river? So he's saying basically, in them days, you could have lined up ships one next to the other, and you could have had control over the river. وَهَذَا يَدٌ عَلَيْهَا. This is considered to be a sign that a person possesses ownership of it. Yeah, so does that mean that someone owns it, someone doesn't own it? I mean, nowadays when we have maps, we say this river falls under this country. So technically they own it. But a river is simply just water that's gushing, it's flowing. Are rivers dug or aren't they naturally formed? So what they're saying is basically, there are some rivers out there that seem to have been dug by people. Maybe, for example, they have dug channels. Yeah, they've kind of controlled the water flow. Okay, so that's the difference between Imam Muhammad and Imam Abu Yusuf on this. So if you look in the bottom over here, it says وَمَاءُ جَيْحُونَ قَالَ الْأَتْرَارِ مَاءُ جَيْحُونَ اسم لنهر بلخ. So this is the north of نهر. So قال السغناقي نهر ترمذ بكسر التاء والذال المعجمة وتبعه الأكمل في ذلك. قلت قال صاحب المراد هو نهر بلخ ومنبعه من عيون بلاد النبيق. So he's saying the origins of this river come from up north somewhere, a place called Nabiq or Nubaiq. يمر ببلخ وترمذ وأسوان. This river flows through the city of Balakh, it flows to Tirmidh, and it flows to Aswan. ويمضي حتى ينصب في بحر الجرجان, until it flows into the sea of Jurjan. Yeah, so most likely Jurjan Sea is talking maybe about the Black Sea. وقال الاسترخي في كتابه إن نهر جيحون يخرج عن حدود بدخشان. So this river, it falls out of the limits of Badakhshan, north of Afghanistan. ثم ينضم إليه أنهار كثيرة, and then many rivers then join this river, and then it becomes like a big river. Yeah, so he's just explaining how this river works. Okay. Yeah, so our rivers are, yes, these will be considered like almost like canals maybe. So because remember in the olden days, rivers if you control rivers, you control a lot of the trade. So what they would do is they would control the flow of rivers. Yeah. So maybe they would like take a big river, like the River Nile, and you branch off from there. Yeah, a stream or a canal. Yeah, and then you're able to direct that towards land that requires water. Anyway, so what's the khulasa of this? And the khulasa of this is basically when it comes to land, if a land has been designated as a property like a dar, a place where there's rooms and structure and buildings, then that there's no ushur or anything on that. But if you were to convert it into a bustan, into a garden where you grow things, then what? So then if a Muslim owns it, then you look at whether it's been irrigated by ushri or kharaji. And then according to whichever one it's been irrigated by, you apply the rule. And if a non-Muslim, then it's always going to be kharaj. Yeah, that's the rule. However, Imam Muhammad rahimahullah obviously would say it's going to be remain as ushur, and Abu Yusuf says double ushur. Okay, وَفِي أَرْضِ الصَّبِي وَالْمَرْأَةِ. And what if there's a land that belongs to a minor, a little child, he's inherited it from his parents, or a land that belongs to a woman, and they're both from the tribe of Taghlib, Bani Taghlib, Taghlibiyin. مَا فِي أَرْضِ الرَّجُلِ التَّغْلِبِ. Yeah, is the same ruling as a land that's owned by a Taghlibi man. Meaning, if there's a child, and this child owns a piece of land, does he have to give kharaj on it? So he would say, no, he has got to give double ushur, because he's a Taghlibi. And what about a woman? So a woman, same. And what about a man? So in other words, when it comes to the Taghlibis, they are considered to be all the same, whether minor, whether woman, whether a man. Right, there's no difference at all. Now, obviously here the question that's going to arise is, didn't we say that zakat is only given to, or is only necessary upon adults? Yeah. And then also the second issue is, didn't we say that kharaj and, when it comes to, jizya is only necessary upon the men? So this is why here he wants to answer those questions. يعني الأشر المضاعف في الأشرية. So he first of all says that ushur is necessary upon them, which is doubled, the double ushur, in ushri land, في الأشرية. والخراج, and if the land is a kharaji land, one kharaj في الخراجية. So depending on what kind of land they live on. So لأن الصلح, the reason for this is because the sulh, in other words, the sulh that has been agreed upon by the government, the Muslim government that has made a pact, a deal with them, قد جرى على تضعيف صدقة. And that was the case that we mentioned last week of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, when he made the agreement with the Taghlibis and they said, we don't want to give jizya, just call it whatever you want. Umar said, but you're going to have to pay double of what we pay zakat. على تضعيف صدقة دون المؤونة المحضة. Yeah, so in other words, the application or the sulh that was applied by the government to them was doubling of the sadaqah and not just purely looking at what the land produces. دون المؤونة المحضة. Yeah, so المؤونة المحضة is basically like what the normal kuffar would have to give. Yeah, they would give purely whatever was produced, kharaj based upon that. And if you read in Fatawa Tatarkhaniya, they actually go through, depending on what you grow, how much kharaj you have to give. Yeah, so they do in jaribs. Yeah, jaribs is like an amount. ثم على الصبي والمرأة, and then the obligation is upon the sabi and upon a woman إذا كان من المسلمين الأشر. So now, if the same land was owned by a Muslim child or a Muslim woman, would they have to give any ushur? So he says ثم على الصبي والمرأة إذا كان من المسلمين. When they are from the Muslims, they would have to give an ushur. فيضعف ذلك. So therefore, that's why the Taghlibis would have to give double of that. إذا كان منهم. Yeah, so if they are from the Taghlibis. And, if you want to read more about this, Binaya has actually discussed this in a bit of detail as well. So he's mentioned about things like the reason why the child has to give it is simply because the mu'una is on the land. It's basically an obligation that revolves around land. So if you own land and you grow something, then you have to give it. And if you don't, then you don't have to give it. So it's no longer based upon like zakat. So zakat is the idea is taklif, right? So if you're an adult and you're baligh and you're sane, etc. And over here, that's not that. It's about the land. This is. Okay. قال وليس في عين القير. Yeah, so there is not in a spring, a qayr spring. So qayr is like crude oil. Yeah, so some sort of like a crude oil. One nift, yeah, and nift is like some sort of oil that comes out from the ground. Yeah, so في أرض العشر شيء. So there is no zakat obligation. There's no tax on anything that is produced. This liquid kind of substance that is produced. So nowadays, for example, petrol, crude oil, etc. ليس في عين القير. There's no qir, there's no zakat, nothing in the spring of qir and nift. لأنه ليس من أنزال الأرض. So remember we talked about the anzal. The anzal is the jama of nuzul. Yeah, and nuzul basically is referring to something which is produced, something which is like a produce of the land. And these things are not produce of the land. إنما هي عين فوارة. These are simply just like water. So water is not a produce of a land. It's just like reserved in the land. It's stored in the land, storage. So إنما هي عين فوارة. This is simply a spring that is gushing forth like a fountain. كعين الماء. So just like you don't have to give zakat if your land has water on there, you don't have to give it on these things as well. وعليه في أرض الخراج خراج. Yeah. So however, عليه, there will be if these exist in kharaj land, في أرض الخراج, you will have to give kharaj on this. Yeah, so وهذا إذا كان حريمهما, and this is only when the harim means the area surrounding it. So let's say for example that the spring is here. So the area that is surrounding it, that's called the harim. That's called the sanctuary. The sanctuary around these two, meaning the qir and the nift, if they are salih lil-zira'a, if they can have something grown on there, then you have to give kharaj. Why is this? لأن الخراج يتعلق بالتمكن من الزراعة. Because kharaj ruling is attached to the capability of being able to grow something. So here there's a difference between ushur land and between kharaj land. Ushur land, you only have to give ushur if you produce something. So if you grow something which is biodegradable, like plants and things, fruit and vegetable. If you grow something, you have to give zakat. However, if you were to grow something on a kharaj land, whether you grow something, you got to give kharaj. And even if you don't grow anything, but the land qualifies for kharaj, you still have to give kharaj. Yeah, so kharaj, the ruling of kharaj is basically, as long as the land qualifies for it, you must give every year, you must give a potential kharaj. Whether you grow something or whether you out of laziness or you're not interested, you don't grow anything, you have to give kharaj on that. That's why he's saying, alayhi fi ard al-kharaj. So in ard al-kharaj, if you had these springs coming out, you don't have to give kharaj on that spring. You have to give kharaj on the potential land around it if it qualifies for growing. So if these two springs were in the middle of a desert, so you own a patch of desert and you have these springs and nothing can grow there, you don't have to give anything. That's the idea. Okay. So, but the qir and the nift itself, there's nothing there. Okay, so this is one section that has been finished. Let's just look at some points, and then we'll look at the next chapter, inshallah. Okay, so I'm just gonna have a look at. Let's have a look at Binaya. So Binaya's got some good points that he mentions, and then I'm just gonna look at Fatawa Hindiya. So Binaya. Okay, so let's show you guys this. Okay. Zakat al-asl. Okay, so here. So if you look at this, this is the 10 types of ushri, or 6 types of ushri land. All right, so first type, Ardul Arab, Kal Hijaz, Wal Yemen, Wa Nahwiya. All the Ardul Arab is considered to be ushri land, including Yemen as well. Number 2, Ardu Aslama Ahluha ala dhalika taw'an. Any land where the people have willingly accepted Islam. Number 3, Ardun Futihat Unwa wa Qusimat bayn al-Ghanimin. Any land that has been opened by force, conquered by force, and the land has been divided between the soldiers. Number 4, Ardun Uhiyat, land that has been given life, wa Suqiyat bima al-Ushr. So there's a land that no one's been using derelict, and its water, Ushr water, has been used, the one that we talked about today. That's also Ushr. Number 5, Al-Ardul Kharajiyah. So Kharaji land, inqata anha ma'ul kharaj, where kharaj water has stopped, meaning it's dried up. It's no longer irrigating the land. فَسُقِيَتْ بِمَاءٍ أُشْرِيٍ, and then it's been irrigated by Ushri land. Yeah, so this land now, this Kharaji land now becomes in the ruling of Ushri now. And number 6, جَعَلَ دَارَهُ بُسْتَانًا, the masla we mentioned today. A person who makes his land into a bustan, his property. وَسَقَاهَا بِمَاءِ الْأُشْرِ. Okay, and then he mentions the Ard al-Kharajiyya Thamanin. So 8 types of Ard Kharaji. Al-Ula al-Ard allati futihat unwa. So land that has been taken by force. وَتُرِكَتْ فِي أَيْدِيهِمْ, but it's been left in their hands. Yeah, so if it hasn't been divided amongst the soldiers, but it's been left to the original inhabitants, then this will be considered to be Kharaji land. Just like Umar radiyan did in the Iraq. So Iraq was considered to be this. Number 2, وَثَانِيَ أَرْضٌ أَحْيَاهَا كَافِرٌ. So let's say there's a piece of land and in a Muslim country, and no one's been using its derelict, and a kafir came along, and with the permission of the government, he's began to grow things on there. Yeah, so that is also considered to be in the ruling of a Kharaji land. So he has to give Kharaj. Number 3, a non-Muslim جعل داره بستانا وسقاه بماء العشر. So non-Muslim, if he was to make his house into a garden and even use ushr, it would still be kharaj for him. Number 4, طلب بعض الكفار من الإمام أن يضرب على أراضيهم خراجا من غير قهر. So let's say some non-Muslims, they requested that the government stipulates upon them kharaj without being forced to do it. So without being forced, they just requested this. Number 5, Ardun Uhiyat bima al-Kharaj. Any land that has been given life with ma al-Kharaj. Number 6, Ardun Ishtaraha Muslim in Kafir, like we mentioned last week. A land that has been purchased by a Muslim from a Kafir. And number 7, Al-Ard al-Ushr إذا انقطع عنها ماء الأشر. So Ushr land, where the supply of Ushr water has stopped, and now it's been irrigated by Kharaj. It becomes Kharaj. And Thamina, that 8th, he says that Muslim Dar, a Muslim has a property, he's made into a garden, and he's fed it with, irrigated it with Kharaj water. We mentioned this before. Yeah, so these are the different types, that you can read it over there. Yeah, different types of this. Alright. If the oil isn't naturally gushing forth but is extracted, is the same? No. So no, there's no. That would apply to, if you remember, we talked about the rulings of the ores, natural ores. Yeah. So al rikaz. So when we talked about the rikaz over there, that's where we had that full discussion about, do you have to give anything if the person finds in their property this. So check that out, inshallah. Okay. Right. Was there anything else I want to mention? Okay, that was one. Okay, let's look in Fatawa al-Hindiyah. So Fatawa Hindiyah. Zakat al-Zuru al-Ashir. Yeah, so it's going to be just before the chapter of Masarif. Okay, so again, if you read Hidayah, I would definitely encourage you guys to read something like Fatawa Hindi on the side. So if you're preparing for the lesson, or if you've studied the lesson, then what you can do is just have a read of what Fatawa Hindi says. Yeah, because he adds a lot of riwayat from the Hanafis, later Hanafis especially, that give a much more clearer picture. So for example here, جعل مسلم داره بستانا فمؤونة الدر, so the masla that we mentioned. But then he quotes as later Hanafi texts. كذا المقابر كذا في البحر, if a graveyard as well. لو أن المسلم والذمي سقاه مرة مع العشر ومرة مع الخراج فالمسلم أحق بالعشر أن الذمي أحق بالخراج. لو حلق الخارج قبل الحصاد, لو أعاره مسلما فزرعه فالعشر. If a person was to borrow some land, Muslim was to borrow some land, and then what would the ruling of the land be if he grows something on there? Okay, so anyway, you can have a read of all that, and it's going to be very useful, inshallah. Okay, next. All right, so next is the chapter of Masarif. Okay, so Masarif, this is basically where you give your zakat. So recipients of zakat. This is to do with the recipients. Babu man yajuzu daf'u sadaqati ilayhi wa man la yajuz. This is the chapter of those people who it's permissible for them to be given zakat and those who it's not permissible. Right, so the Quran mentions in Surah Tawbah 8 categories of people to whom sadaqat can be given. So that's why it says قال الأصل فيه قوله تعالى, and the principle in this chapter is the verse of the Quran إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليه والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل. These are the 8 categories. Okay, these are 8 categories that this revolves around. Al-ayah. Now there are some also some details that we need to know from hadith as well. So for example, like there's some people that even though they might fall under faqir, you still can't give them. Yeah. So for example, like they are from the Ahlul Bayt, they can't be given it. That's what we're going to discuss that later. فهذه ثمانية أصناف. He says these are 8 types. وقد سقط منها المؤلفة قلوبهم. Yeah. So مؤلفة القلوب has dropped from this. So the مؤلفة القلوب are those whose hearts are to be reconciled. يألف يؤلف, تأليف means to bring together, and قلوب is heart. So مؤلفة القلوبهم or قلوبهم, these are considered those people whose hearts are to be reconciled. So out of the 8 then, so 7 are left. لأن الله تعالى أعز الإسلام وأغنى عنهم. And the reason for this is because Allah Ta'ala has strengthened Islam, has given Islam strength, وَأَغْنَى عَنْهُمْ, and has made Muslims independent of them. وَعَلَى ذَلِكَ انعقد الإجماع, and upon this the ijma' has been established. So this concept of the mu'allafatul qulub, this is a very detailed category. Yeah, and the reason for this is because there were about 13 people in the time of the Prophet ﷺ who were given zakat based upon mu'allafat al-qulub. And mu'allafat al-qulub is not just one category, it's subdivided into multiple categories. There's different types of mu'allafat al-qulub. Yeah, some of them are Muslims, some of them are, most of them are non-Muslims, and for various reasons. So if you actually look in the in the hashia over here, it actually mentions hum kanu thalathatu anwa. They were of 3 types. He's saying there were 3 types of them. He says, نوع كان يتألفهم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. There was one group the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم would try to reconcile in order for them ليسلموا ويسلم قومهم بإسلامهم, so that they accept Islam, and because they were very influential, their qawm would also accept Islam. So this was like a strategy. So these people who are very kind of close to Islam, you give them some financial aid, they become Muslim, and then their qawm becomes Muslim. وَنَوْءٌ مِّنْهُمْ أَسْلَمُوا, and there's another category who actually became Muslim, لكن على ضعف, but they were very weak. So maybe they were in a poor state, or maybe shaky in their faith. They weren't really kind of strong. So the Prophet ﷺ would يزيد تقرير فيزيد تقريرهم لضعفهم. So this money would come handy because it would strengthen and keep them firm. Just like, for example, like you have someone who accepts Islam, converts nowadays, they accept Islam, and then maybe unfortunately they leave the fold of Islam after a few months when they find it's difficult to be able to gain like some sort of a firm footing in Islam. So financial support helps these people. وَنَوْءٌ مِّنْهُمْ لِدَفْعِ شَرِّهِمْ. And there was a category from amongst them that was for دفع الشر. Yeah, like for example, Uyayna bin Hisan, Aqra bin Habis, Abbas ibn Mirdas. Yeah, so these were originally from the Ru'asa Quraysh. These were like from the main leaders of Quraysh. So to save the Muslims from being attacked by them or being abused by them or whatever, so financial aid would go towards them. Like you can almost say like a lobbying group that supports a particular political party. It's a bit like that. Anyway, if in Binaya, he's mentioned more detail about this. Okay, and like I said, these are different types of groups as well. So he says in Aqad al-Ijma'. So the Ijma' basically happened was in the time of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. What happened was they came to Abu Bakr asking for their share of the Mu'allafat al-Qulub. So Abu Bakr was about to give them, and then Umar radiallahu anhu found out, and then Umar radiallahu anhu came to them and said, no, you're not getting anything. And then they got upset and they said, you're not the Khalifa, Abu Bakr is the Khalifa. So they went to Abu Bakr and they told Abu Bakr, and then Umar said, look, the Prophet ﷺ used to give them because Islam was weak. Now that Islam has become strong, we don't need it from them anymore now. It's no longer needed. So this is where there is a difference of opinion of how did this ruling end? Yeah, like if it's in the Quran, if something is categorically mentioned in the Quran, how is it possible that something can cease and no longer remain part of the Quran anymore, even though it's still there, we still read it? How is this? Has nasakh taken place? So the only group of people who actually say the Mu'allafat al-Qulub are still existent today are the Zahiriyah. So the Zahiriyah are the group that say this group will remain because the Quran says it and it hasn't been adjusted anyway. Others have different answers for this. Yeah, so some of them say that this is based upon the Ijma'. So the Ijma' is indicating towards something that was there in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and that thing really was the one that cancelled out the ruling. It did nasakh. Abrogation did not take place of the Ijma', but because of something else. That's one opinion. Another opinion is that no, Ijma', if it's categorical Ijma', qat'i Ijma', it can actually abrogate a verse of the Quran. Because if it's categorical, that means it must have come from the Prophet ﷺ. That's the second view. Third view is that this is based upon illah. So the illah is basically Umar radiallahu anh, in his time, he saw that the illah had disappeared, and now if the illah was to return, then the ruling could return again. So it's all an illah based. These are three types. And if you read in Binaya again, he's mentioned more. And if you read in Ma'arif al-Sunan, so Maulana Yusuf Banuri has actually gone into a lot of details. He's done a lot of extensive explanation of these different types of Mu'allafat al-Qulub, and also about this ruling of, like, even amongst the Hanafis, that is it a nasakh? In that case, this ruling will never come back, or is it that the illah has ceased? Yeah, is it because of the ceasing of the illah? In which case, the ruling might be able to return. Okay, so wal faqiru man lahu. The next, wal faqir. Who is the faqir? So the faqir man lahu adna shay'in. Faqir is that person who has adna shay. Adna shay meaning that he has the bare minimum. Yeah, so he has bare minimum. Wal miskinu man la shay'a lahu. And a miskin is someone who has nothing. So this whole discussion, like I said, Mu'allafat al-Qulub, there's still more discussion to be done with Mu'allafat al-Qulub, but we don't want to spend too much time because then we won't be able to get through the book. So I'll just tell you where to look. So Binaya has probably got the most extensive explanation that you can find in Ma'arif al-Sunan, and Faqir and Miskina. So are these two considered to be the same? This is where there's a whole big linguistic discussion regarding the Faqir and regarding the Miskin. So he's explained it as, Imam Quduri has explained it as man lahu adna shay, the person who has the bare minimum. So a person who has bare minimum wealth, like we would say the person has less than the nisab. he has above zero, but he has less than the nisab. And a miskeen is a person who's worse off than a faqir. A miskeen has nothing. So this is an attempt to use language, the linguistic, translation or the linguistic interpretation of this. هذا مروي عن أبي حنيفة. This is also reported from Imam Abu Hanifa. That this differentiation, that faqir is man lahu adna shay, and miskin is someone who has nothing at all. Well, however, وقد قيل, it is said the opposite way around. So some have said no, faqir is the one that has the nothing, and a miskin is the one that has a bare minimum. وَلِكُلٍّ وَجْهٌ, and each one seems to have their own dalil. Meaning, Sahib al-Hidayah is trying to say, well, we don't really know what the real difference between faqir and miskin is. We can't put our finger on it. Generally, the Hanafis say that all of the categories of the mu'allaf, the recipients of zakat must have poverty. There must be an element of poverty below the threshold, the nisab, besides one category, besides the amiluna. The amiluna are the ones who actually can be rich and they can still receive money from zakat by the government, which is going to come next. So he says, وَقَدْ قِيلَ عَلَى الْعَكْسِ, and some have said, no, it's the other way around. And this is also a position of Imam Tahawi. Imam Tahawi seems to have inclined towards this, and a lot of the linguists have inclined towards this. وَلِكُلٍّ وَجْهٍ ثُمَّ هُمَا صِنْفَانِ أَوْ صِنْفٌ وَاحِدٌ. So then the argument is, are they both two different categories? Then why did Allah mention, or are they one? If they're one, why did Allah mention two? Why didn't Allah just say faqir? And that would automatically include the miskin. He says, سَنَذْكُرُهُ فِي كِتَابِ الْوَصَايَا inshallah. So ultimately, Kitab al-Wasaya is basically to do with bequests. So if a person's going to die and they leave behind a will and they want some like money to go towards non-heirs, so non-inheritance, then this would come under wasaya. So in other words, if a person, for example, said, when I die, I want £1,000 to go to the fuqara of Birmingham. What does that mean? And if he said, I want this money to go to the masakeen of Birmingham, what would that mean? Could I give that money to both categories and still fulfill the wishes of the dying or the deceased? Or must I give it to a specific? That's where these masail, like being accurate in these masail, is going to become handy. But anyway, besides that, what is the differences between? So if you look in the Hashi over here, he's actually quoted from Binaya as well, where he's mentioned about this. He says, أما الوجه الأول وهو أن يكون المسكين أسوأ حالا من الفقير, is where the miskin is worse off than the faqir. This is because in the Quran Allah says, أو مسكينا ذا متربة. So أو مسكينا ذا متربة, meaning, or that miskin who is someone who is the possessor of dirt. Like all he's got is dirt. ذا متربة. So he's he's like turab, he's under turab. لاصقا بالتراب من الجوع والعرى, meaning nakedness or عرى. وأما وجه من قال بالثاني, and as for the people who taken the second view, which is that no, the faqir is the one that's worse off. وهو أن الفقير أسوأ حالا من المسكين فقوله أما السفينة فكانت لمساكين. So the argument is, look, in the Quran Allah says in the story of Musa alayhi salam with Khidr, as for the ship, it belonged to, it was for masakeen. So how can someone be a miskin and own a ship? That's their argument. But in Binaya, he's actually done a whole discussion on this and back and forth. And he's saying really there's no real kind of strong sort of like categorical evidence to say that either side is correct. The word faqir comes from the word faqar, which also comes from the spine. Your spine is called your fiqar. So a faqir is known as maksur al-fiqar. So maksur al-fiqar means someone whose back is broken. So that could also indicate towards back broken in the sense financially not having the ability to be able to do things, move about. And miskin could come from, maskana, as in someone who has no maskana, has no place of living. So that's why there's a lot of sort of like possibility of what this could mean. But anyway, as long as they're below the nisab, then technically they come under this. Okay, we'll stop there because the next part I have to mention some things. Okay, so let me just check, was there anything else I wanted to mention? Yeah, so remember I told you in Binaya where it says the Mu'allafat al-Qulub, there were 13 men. So he quotes from Abu Musa al-Madini. He says, whom Abu Sufyan was amongst them, Al-Harith ibn Abi Hisham, Abdul Rahman ibn Yarbu, Hakim ibn Hizam. So a lot of these famous Sahaba that you hear about, initially they were people who were given these handouts. Yeah, for this. Okay, so you can check that out yourself. Okay, so here's a good point that he mentions over here. He says, فَإِنْ قُلْتَ, if someone says, كَيْفَ تُصْرَفُ الزَّكَاةُ, how is it possible that zakat can be given to them when they're kuffar, they're non-Muslim, they don't believe in Allah? قُلْتُ الْجِهَادُ واجب على فقراء المسلمين. Jihad is necessary upon the fuqara of the Muslimin. Muslims, even if they're poor, if the time for jihad comes, they would have to do it. وَأَغْنِيَاءُهُمْ, and even upon أغنيائهم لِدَفْءِ شَرِّهِمْ, yeah, to repel the shar of the kuffar. The idea is that jihad is necessary upon all Muslims, irrespective of your financial status, to repel the fitna of the kuffar. فَكَانَ يَدْفَعْ إِلَيْهِمْ سَحْمٌ مِّن سِحَامِ الْفُقَرَاءِ. So the idea was that Sharia allows for a portion that the fuqara are supposed to get. It gives it to the kuffar. كان ذلك قائما مقام الجهاد. So the fiqh over here is basically, it's as though this money that you're giving is almost a substitute of the jihad that the fuqara are meant to do. في ذلك الوقت لعجز الفقراء عنه, because the fuqara would be too weak to be able to fight. So a portion of their wealth will be taken from them and given. ثم سقط لعدم الحاجة. And then he goes, this is dropped because of the adam al-haja. Yeah, so this is a very good point that he's kind of mentioned, like a very nice, you can almost say like a nukta. Yeah, nukta, which is a very nice detailed point, a fiqh point over here. Why is it that kuffar can get this? So it seems as though the underlying reason is this idea. فَإِنْ قُلْتَ لَا يَجُوزُ النَّسْخ بِالْإِجْمَاعِ. So this is another question that he raises. How is it possible that, ijma' cannot take place? Ijma' cannot result in nasakh. How is that? That was some of the answers I gave you before. Yeah, so we say one is that maybe there was a text, that's what Umar radiallahu was actually using. And this is not ijma', this is actually intihai al-illah. So intihai al-illah is where the illah ceases, and then, or this could have been because, like we said, that the ijma' is not doing nasakh, but the ijma' is indicating towards nasakh, and so forth. Okay, anyway, so you can read more of that. It's got some good nice points in there. Okay, so just to summarize today then, if you've got any questions, you can ask questions over here. So he says, so today we did about the land, we said about the Muslim land that has been converted into a bustan. If it's been irrigated by ushur, then he's got to give ushur. If it's kharaj, then kharaj. And what about a non-Muslim, like a majusi? It could be anyone, not just majusi. Then we said over here, likewise, he doesn't have to give anything on his home, but if he was to convert into a bustan, then he'd have to give kharaj in any case. And what are the famous rivers that were known at that time? So we mentioned the difference between Muhammad and Abu Yusuf rahimullah on these 4 rivers, famous rivers. And what about child? Does the child have to give kharaj that belongs to the tribe of Bani Taghlib, and the woman? And we said yes, they have to give it, and it'll be double the same. And what about if a land produces nift, yeah, and qir? So we say if it's a ushri land, then nothing, and if it's a kharaji land, they don't really have to give anything on that, but if the land qualifies for growing, then they have to give. Okay. Could matraba mean soil as in having only a home? I don't think anyone's mentioned that. Yeah, that's a bit difficult to say. Matraba. Yeah. So matraba means like kathratus. This ties for mubalagha. Yeah, the matrab, like the Prophet ﷺ called Ali radiallahu anhu Abu Turab. Yeah, so Abu Turab means that someone who's stuck to the Turab. Is there a condition placed when giving it, such as if you're stopping insulting Islam, you can get money, or is just so that's one of the things that some of these people would be given handouts to stop them from like causing more problems for Muslims. So it was like a preventative measure. Yeah. Okay, and then we talked about the people that you can give zakat to. All right, Jazakumullah khair, guys, and inshallah we'll see you guys next lesson. Assalamu alaikum.